In a recent paper, which was published after an important conference organized on the topic by the University of Ottawa and my dear friend and colleague, Professor Bélanger, I argue that there are essentially 10 really straightforward reasons why Canada should join the American Convention. The first one is that the first reason is that this is what has been expressed by the great majority of experts that the Canadian government has consulted on the issue. First reason. Second reason, and by in parentheses, this process of consultation was also noted by the Canadian Senate Human Rights Committee in 2 reports in 2003 and 2005, which I encourage you to read, and you'll see the overwhelming majority of expert opinions in favor of joining the convention. The second reason, essentially, is that it would provide the Canadian population or persons under the control of Canada, because actually any person under the control of Canada, whether citizen or not, can use the inter-American system. So if Canada was to join the convention, then more people would have access to an additional human rights recourse, which is, in my opinion, more complete. Right now, people can denounce violations committed in Canada either before the Human Rights Committee with respect to alleged violations of the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ratified by Canada, or before the American Convention, arguing alleged violations of the American Declaration on the Rights and Duties of Man. Processes before the Human Rights Committee in the case system is essentially a written one. It has lots of procedural limitations, difficulty to present expert evidence, oral evidence, and so forth, which is, of course, extremely important for Indigenous peoples related human rights cases, where oral evidence is of course, very important. The oral process can be done before the Inter-American Human Rights Commission process, but it is very seldomly done because the Commission has very little opportunities to do so. In both cases, either before the committee or the American Convention, decisions by the committee and the Commission are recommendations, technically speaking, under international law, and Canada has a good faith obligation to comply with those. They're not judgments that are obligatory under international human rights law. A judgment by the Inter-American Court, if Canada was to join the convention and recognize its competence, would allow for, firstly, a trial would allow, firstly, for oral proceedings, as well as presentation of expert evidence and testimonies, oral evidence, and so forth, provide with more detailed judgments, and also the judgments would be obligatory under international human rights law, which I think is a big advantage for persons under the control of Canada. So an additional and a better recourse for victims. The third reason is that the standards that are developed by the Inter-American system, and in particular by the court, are extremely relevant for human rights and protecting human rights in Canada. More and more decisions are related to Indigenous peoples, women's rights, discrimination, a new trend of decisions on economic, social, and cultural rights, on social security, for example, or workers' rights, and so forth. So, and it also a very important jurisprudential development on the rights of migrants, which is, of course, a very important issue in the Americas. So, all of these standards that are being developed in the Inter-American system, I think, would come and enrich the standards and the pool of standards in which Canadians can benefit from. The fourth reason that I argued earlier relates to the fact that, contrary to what some people have said, there is no real legal obstacle to joining the American Convention. There's no real incompatibility with the convention and Canadian domestic law. Actually, there's been essentially two big debates about the compatibility of both legal norms. Firstly, some have argued that the crime of publishing hateful propaganda in Canada might be incompatible with the prohibition of prior censorship contained in Article 13 of the American Convention. I don't agree. I think the inter-American system has provided for clear exceptions with these types of expression, hateful expressions, and it's clearly a jurisprudential trend that has been in line with that of other international human rights bodies, including the Human Rights Committee, which has, of course, considered that Canada's domestic legislation on the matter is not incompatible with human rights. The other obstacle that has sometimes been raised is the fact that Canada has domestic legislation that allows for abortions, while the Article 4 of the American Convention provides for the protection of the right to life from the moment of conception in general. Again, I consider that there's no incompatibility because as the Commission and the Court both have recognized in several decisions, the wording in general has been added to the text of Article 4 in order to allow states to have more flexibility and margin of maneuver while protecting the right to life from the moment of conception, and to allow states that do not criminalize abortion. In fact, there's a series of decisions going in that direction. The Baby Boy case versus the United States in the Inter-American Commission, as well as the more recent in vitro fertilization case regarding Costa Rica before the Inter-American Court. And both of these decisions and trends follow, again, the general trend adopted by international human rights bodies, including the Human Rights Committee, which, as mentioned earlier, rules on cases regarding Canada. So I don't think there's any legal obstacle with respect to both types of norms. There's no incompatibility either with respect to the legal culture of the inter-American system and that of Canada. That's my fifth reason. Essentially, some have argued that the inter-American system is a system that's been created essentially for civil law tradition Latin American states. Actually, both the Commission and the Court do not rule on specific legal tradition issues. They consider whether norms, domestic norms and domestic mechanisms ensure the full protection of human rights under the American Convention. And in fact, many decisions have been related to common law countries, in particular regarding the United States, for example, on indigenous peoples' rights issues and all the British, Canadian, and American common law related to, for example, indigenous peoples' territorial rights, which is a very complex common law doctrine, as you know, and the inter-American system has done a great job on this issue. And similarly, addressing, for example, common law, criminal legal systems of the English-speaking Caribbean in the Inter-American Court, for example. So I don't see any incompatibility with the legal traditions. On the contrary, I think as I'm trying to demonstrate in my Trudeau Foundation project, the Inter-American system and its diversity of approaches can enrich the Canadian experience of dealing with human rights and engaging in reconciliation. Sixth reason, I've always argued that by joining the American Convention, it would allow Canada to have more strength and impact in its regional diplomacy regarding human rights. Essentially, because when Canada approaches a neighbor state of the region, a friend state of the region, and complains about human rights violations occurring in that country, essentially the response, the classic response that's been formulated, who are you to come and complain about human rights in our country? You're not even a full member of the system. You haven't joined the American Convention. Join the American Convention and then come back and complain about my report card. And this is something that has actually occurred in the past. In particular, if you'll recall, in the early 2000s, Minister of Foreign Affairs Axworthy was pressuring the then President Fujimori of Peru on a whole bunch of democracy and human rights related issues. And Peru's response was, thank you for your point of view, but for us it's not very useful and important, because you're not a real member of our system. So do your homework before complaining about my performance. And of course, that has weakened Canada's human rights diplomacy efforts in that time. And it has occurred in other circumstances, as I described in other papers. The seventh reason is essentially that by joining the American Convention, Canada would be more coherent with its regional economic policies. As you know, Canadian industries are very present in the Americas. Canada has ratified a series of free trade agreements with many countries of the continent, and in part to ensure a more fluid economic relations for Canadian companies in Latin America and vice versa. I think it's totally incoherent to ask for a friendly country of the region to open up its markets, to deregulate, to privatize in certain circumstances, and require reciprocal treatment with respect to trade, but not have the same human rights standards. So essentially saying to another country, let's say Colombia, with which we have a free trade agreement, adopt a series of economic measures to allow our companies to perform better in your country. And we'll have this similar relationship towards you. But we'll hold you to a higher standard in terms of human rights, including human rights of persons that interact with our companies abroad. And we'll hold you to a higher standard, and will be answerable to a lower standard with respect to your interests as far as we're concerned, because we haven't joined the American Convention. So for me, these double standards create uncertainty. Investors don't like uncertainty. Economic relationships require stability and require clear common standards that be applicable to all. So I think joining the American Convention would certainly be more coherent with our regional economic policy. Eighth reason, is that by joining Canada joining the Inter-American system, that would strengthen the system in itself. As some of you know, the Inter-American system is essentially composed of two types of countries. Unfortunately, there are countries that have um, joined the organization, joined the American Convention, recognized the compulsory jurisdiction of the court, which are essentially Latin American, Spanish, or Portuguese-speaking countries. And then another group of countries that have not joined the American Convention, not recognized the compulsory jurisdiction of the court, and basically are bound by the American Declaration and only by decisions of the Inter-American Commission. So these are essentially English-speaking countries, the Caribbean, the United States, and Canada. So of course, if Canada was to join, it would strengthen the system by making a more universal system with more states adhering to a higher human rights standard and recognizing more institutional protections for people in the continent, and hopefully that would encourage other states to do the same. Oddly enough, the Inter-American system does not require the adhesion by its members to the most important human rights treaty to be a member of the system. While in the European system, to become a member of the European Council, for example, it is mandatory to ratify the European Convention and recognize the compulsory jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights. So I think we should go in the same line and make sure that all member states of the organization are full members of the human rights system to play in the same field, let's say. Ninth reason is essentially the reason why I'm doing my Trudeau Foundation project, is because I think Canada can learn from Latin America's human rights experience on a whole bunch of levels. Firstly, of course, Latin America's recent human rights history has shown, dramatic human rights violations in the course of dictatorships and civil wars and so forth. But it has come over these obstacles and in many instances has become stronger out of these processes by, changing laws, changing political processes, strengthening mechanisms to better protect human rights and so forth. So I think we can learn from that. We can learn from also the experience of the newly adopted protections for the rights of indigenous peoples, protections regarding racial and gender-based discrimination, and also very progressive economic and social rights policies, for example. The other very important area where Canada can learn from Latin America's experience is in transitional justice related matters. Canada has recently adopted transitional justice-like or type of mechanisms to address Indigenous people's dramatic experiences, in particular regarding the boarding school experiences, as well as the violence against women in Quebec and in Canada. And these processes were truth-telling, where victims came forward and formulated their grievances, tried to document the phenomena, as well as to formulate recommendations. And this is something that Latin American societies have done a lot since the mid-'80s, after the fall of most of the dictatorships, to overcome the trauma of massive and systemic human rights violations, whether it be in Chile, Argentina, Peru, and other in Central America and so forth. So I think there's a lot we can learn from these experiences in order to truly address historic human rights violations, including those related to Canadian Indigenous peoples. The final reason, my 10th reason, is essentially that joining the American Convention is the Canadian thing to do. Canada brags, particularly now, that it wants to reach the a seat at the the UN Security Council, it brags to be one of the world's human rights champion. It's true that Canada has always been present when, important human rights norms were negotiated historically, and has adopted very progressive, foreign policies regarding human rights and so forth. But in my opinion, if you want to be a human rights champion, both regionally and internationally, you absolutely have to show the good example of joining all possible international human rights law treaties. And for me, it's completely incoherent with this human rights champion attitude not to be a full member of the Inter-American human rights system. This has been a debate since 1990, and my human rights colleagues in Latin America don't understand often what is taking us so long to not only talk about human rights in the region, but also, go for very specific and positive actions, such as joining the American Convention and joining the compulsory, recognizing the compulsory jurisdiction of the court.